Improper disassembly or reassembly of an actuator can cause serious injury. These tasks should be done only in strict compliance with the manufacturer's recommendations. Please continue to read the various cautions and warnings. Click Next to continue. The Next button is green and to the right of this text box. Ensure that you have had a pre-job briefing prior to beginning work. Make sure that you follow proper tag-out process. You may press the Docs button to the right to review or add pertinent documentation. The equipment listed below should be available during the maintenance procedure. The precautions listed below should be used before disassembling the actuator. Record the current valve position and configuration. Then isolate by shutting off the main air supply. Click on the main air supply valve to close. Confirm that all air pressure is bled off. Verify that the stem is lowered. Read gauges and open the regulator petcocks. Next, you will remove the regulator. With the air supply shut off and the internal air pressure of the AOV bled off, remove the main air supply tubing connected to the regulators. Only remove tubing necessary for disassembly. Select the wrench from the toolbox. Then click on each pair of end connectors to remove each tube. Repeat until all of the tubes have been removed. With the air supply shut off and the internal air pressure of the AOV bled off, remove the tube from the positioner to the actuator casing. With the air supply shut off and the internal air pressure of the AOV bled off, remove the tube from the regulator to the positioner. Next, to manually operate the AOV during the removal process, you need to attach a test regulator rig to the diaphragm casing. Note that the test regulator rig includes both a manually operated test regulator and pressure gauge. Select both the wrench and the test regulator rig from the toolbox. Then click on both the main air supply connector and the diaphragm casing connector to attach. Back out the test regulator knob completely, closing the valve, to ensure that you do not provide overpressure when you open the main valve. Click on the test regulator knob to back it out completely to 0. With the test regulator closed, open the main air supply valve. Be sure to do so slowly to avoid a rapid change in pressure. Click on the main air supply valve to open. Before removing the positioner, be sure to note or record the position of the connection to the feedback arm for consistency during reassembly. Click on the feedback arm to confirm its position. The next step is to remove the positioner from the yoke. To do this, remove the linkage between the positioner and the stem connector. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on the linkage to remove. Using a wrench, remove the 2 mounting bolts holding the positioner frame to the yoke. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on each of the mounting bolts to remove. The next step is to remove the regulator. Using a wrench, remove the 2 mounting bolts holding the regulator to the yoke. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on each of the mounting bolts to remove. Now that the positioner, regulator, and their air tubes have been removed from the AOV, the remaining maintenance and inspection steps can either be conducted in the field, or in the case of a high radiation area, in the shop, after removing the entire actuator assembly from the valve. This lesson is based on removing the actuator assembly from the valve and completing the maintenance procedures in the shop. Before attempting to uncouple the actuator and valve stem, the spring pressure or stored energy needs to be relieved. Positioning the valve to mid-stroke will relieve the tension. Click on the test regulator knob to screw it in sufficiently, opening the valve, to raise the travel indicator to mid-stroke. Next, use a wrench to remove the stem connector, being careful not to damage the stem threads. Be certain to support the valve stem to prevent it from dropping onto the valve seat suddenly when released. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on each of the stem connector bolts to remove. Now that the stem connector has been removed, the actuator stem and the valve stem are no longer attached to each other. Measure and log the distance between the top of the travel indicator disc and the bottom of the actuator stem. Raise the actuator stem using the test regulator to create a gap wide enough to insert a small wooden block. Click on the test regulator knob to screw it in. Insert a wooden block into the gap between the actuator stem and the valve stem. Click the wooden block to insert it. Lower the actuator stem until it touches the wood block using the test regulator. You will use the wood block to push the valve stem down and reseat the valve in a closed position. Once the actuator stem touches the top of the block, continue to push the valve stem downward using the wood block pushed by the actuator stem. Click on the test regulator knob to back it out, closing the valve, lowering the actuator stem and valve stem to reseat the valve fully. Re-raise actuator stem using the test regulator to loosen and remove wood block. Carefully remove the wood block, taking care not to damage the threads or leave any wood chips inside the parts. Use a tape measure to measure the distance between the bottom of the actuator stem and the bottom of the spring adjuster for use during reassembly task guide. Click the spring adjuster to indicate that you have logged the measurement. Lower the actuator stem and bleed off all air using the test regulator knob. Click on the tip now that the spring connector has been removed. Loosen the spring adjuster until the bottom is close to the bottom of the actuator stem and the spring is loose. All pressure removed. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on the spring adjuster to loosen it. Shut off the main air supply in preparation for safely removing the yoke assembly from the valve. Click on the main air supply valve to close. With the main air supply shut off, remove the test regulator rig. Select the wrench from the toolbox and click on both test regulator rig connectors to remove. Next, match mark the yoke to the valve as necessary for accurate reassembly. Locate and click on the match mark to confirm. Place brass rod against yoke lock nut lug and tap counterclockwise to loosen. Select the hammer and brass rod from the toolbox and click on the yoke lock nut to loosen it. Now that the yoke lock nut has been loosened, unscrew it by hand and remove it from the valve. Click on the yoke lock nut to unscrew and remove. Now that everything is loose, firmly lift the yoke assembly straight up and then away from the valve stem. Pay extra attention to the overlapping actuator and valve stems during the lift, making sure not to damage the threads. Click on the yoke assembly to lift it off the valve. With the yoke assembly lifted from the valve stem, you can now transport it to a convenient location for the rest of the disassembly. Bag and tag all loose parts and transport with actuator. Perform a general inspection of the valve and report any abnormalities. Click Next to continue. Congratulations! You have completed detaching the AOV yoke assembly from the valve. Click on the main menu to open the task list, to continue disassembly in the workshop, the About page, or to exit the application.